Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, Cloud Computing, Overview of Legal Issues, Risks, and Claims. In today's webinar, Mr. Wilf and Mr. Huston will discuss layers of cloud services, how clients use the cloud, jurisdiction and legal issues, cloud services for lawyers, and evidence. To give you a little background about our presenters, Fred Wilf is a managing partner of Wilf Tech LLC, a technology, intellectual property, and business law firm in Huntington Valley, PA. Fred works with companies of all sizes for technology and intellectual property matters. Shawn Huston is the CEO of Legal Support Partners, a firm that offers e-discovery, forensic technology, and consulting services to law firms and corporations. Over the years, Shawn has worked on a number of high-profile civil and criminal cases. For those of our attendees who require a passcode, the word for today is cloud. During the Q&A session, we'll ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself and stay for the full 60 minutes. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with a link to the archive recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list on the left of your screen. Thank you all again for attending today, and Fred and Shawn, the presentation is now turned over to the both of you.
Thanks, Emily. We're break into the program here, the overview of cloud computing. We're actually going to start off with a poll question for all of the attendees asking, do you store client files in the cloud currently? So I guess if they could just answer the poll real quick, and we can move on to see the results. So far, it looks like the results are 63% say no, and 30% roughly are saying yes.
That's impressive.
So it's interesting to see two-thirds. I think it's interesting that two-thirds saying no, considering the amount of technology that folks use in their daily lives, but we'll touch on some of that in through the program here. But
it also raises the question of how many people know that the client files are or not in the cloud. So hopefully we can discuss that a bit as well during this hour. So let's begin. We're showing right here a diagram. It's just the top diagram showing the cloud. We want to spend just a little bit of time as review for those who may not already know what the cloud is. What are we talking about? What do we mean when we say the cloud? And what we mean is a certain type of technology that is it's all computer technology. And as you see from the diagram, which looks a little bit old, it goes back to the day when you would create these drawings that show how technology was established in a particular location. And any time that you would draw a computer system, and part of the computer system required using some telecommunication aspect, whether it be a telephone system connecting some of the components, or leased lines, or some other telecommunication piece, you would draw a cloud. And the cloud became any form of telecommunications that was used in the technology. So going back here as much as 50 years, but essentially the cloud, as the icon was and still is, used to indicate some sort of network that connects different users or different pieces of a network in different locations to each other. What does this mean? Well, there's a couple of aspects to it. The question really becomes from the technology side is, where do you want your computers? You have a network, you have a system, you can have the computers, you can have the software, you can have the people in different locations. Do you want the computers near you? Do you want the software near you? Do you want your data near you? Or do you want the software, the computers, and the technology farther away where somebody else can review it, can manage it, take care of it for you? So cloud computing now, and what used to be then in the back of the day used to be called time sharing, went by other names as well. The idea is pretty much the same, that somebody else would hold the computers, somebody else would manage the computers, someone else would take care of the programming, the data would sit far away, and use some sort of telecommunications to connect the user to the data. What we're showing here in the slide is, on the left, is a photograph of an old mainframe, which again was a computer that was remote to the user. And on the right-hand side is a modern room, basically a server room or server farm. And each of those little devices actually is its own little server. There can be thousands upon thousands of them in a single room.
And if anybody who's been into any of the modern data centers, they would recognize kind of the look of that image on the lower right-hand side. My data center looks similar to that, where it's just rows and rows, seemingly miles of server racks, all humming along.
So we have in cloud computing and its predecessors, the computer, the servers are far away, along with the data and the software that controls the data. But you need something to connect the user to that data. You need to have some sort of technology to connect the user to that data. And that could be, back in the day, there was these portable terminals. But today, what you use to connect to the data could be a laptop computer, it can be a desktop computer, or it could be a smartphone, which is what we're seeing on the right. In any event, the options are available to the user, that the local machine, whatever the user is putting his or her hands on, can have a lot of power, or can have very little power to it, but all of the real power is someplace else where somebody else can take care of it. And that has some real benefits. Mostly it has economies of scale. You can get people to watch over it, but more importantly, you can have a lot of data, a lot of users, all in one set of machines, and it becomes a lot cheaper to make that available to a larger number of people.
Yeah, and I think this is where the question comes about whether people are using the quote cloud or not gets fuzzy, because I think there's a lack of understanding that a lot of these modern technologies are using sub-cloud system in some way or another. That iPhone that's using iCloud or any of the Apple products, it's all to a certain extent in the cloud. Microsoft's pushing OneDrive to every single, seemingly everything that uses Windows these days. Google Docs. I mean, just go on. And it's essentially and kind of what you were talking about, Fred, in terms of how the term cloud came about, in terms of that being kind of a connector between folks. That's essentially that's our internet as we know it.
Yeah.
So.
And for lawyers especially looking at this, you may not realize when we say cloud that includes some of the better-known services. You may think of it as a service. You may think of it as something else. They come under a different title, but things such as Google Mail or Gmail, Hotmail, you mentioned, Shawn, iTunes. These are all cloud-based systems. The software and the data is someplace else, and you connect to it through the internet or another telecommunication network.
And just to mention before we go too far further, there's going to be a couple question and answer periods. So if you have, if anyone does have questions, feel free to enter them in the chat box. But so when we get to that point, we'll be happy to answer any questions that do come up. So cloud, the usage of the cloud is primarily broken down into a few layers of services, and kind of how those work depends on what your particular needs are. So one of them being infrastructure as a service, where essentially someone is creating a blank slate of infrastructure for you, similar to for my data center purposes. Essentially, that's what we have, where we're assigned for some of our products a certain amount of raw space, and we get to do with it as we choose. And that's from the average user standpoint, that's probably not what they're primarily using. But that is available, and a lot of businesses and even technology businesses use infrastructure as a service, rather than essentially building their own data center.
And for the less techie among us, you think of it as well. You can be buying or building a house or building an office building. How much of this are you doing yourself, and how much is somebody else doing? You think of infrastructure as a service as somebody supplying you with the foundation, and you got to build the rest of the building.
Yeah. That's actually a really good way of putting it in terms of that. So but again, there's benefits to that. Again, there's economies of scale and certain redundancies that can be built in something like that without having to recreate the wheel every time, therefore adding cost. Another option is a platform as a service. So similar to infrastructure as a service, where you would get, like Fred was saying, the foundation for that house that you're going to build. In this case, you would get the foundation and the tools to build it. So whether it's software tools or whatever it is, depending on what you're trying to put together, those would be included in that type of service agreement to allow you to build on that back-end platform. So licenses for things for different products and things of that nature.
Yeah, and we have some references here on the last slide and this slide, the click-wrap agreements. Whichever layer of technology you're using, because you can buy these layers or lease these layers individually, each of these is a separate agreement. A lot of the providers of these services will have an online click-wrap agreement, which means that anybody who wants these services can just go to that website, review the online agreement, click I agree, and they're bound. And then at that point, they get access to the service. Yeah,
and that's something I'm sure, and we'll get into in the software as a service too. I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with those types of things. You going to general websites and, again, using things like iTunes and, whatever the system that you use. It's fairly common these days. Am I right?
Absolutely. And because of changes to U.S. law and in most countries, they are enforceable. So that those, and to lawyers who haven't looked into this yet, there's both in the U.S. there's both federal and state laws that make the online agreements enforceable if you do them right.
Yeah, well, I guess that's always the asterisk next to it.
It's always a test.
Yeah. So and then finally, software as a service. Now this is, I think this is where, honestly, a lot of our business lives are lived these days, whether we realize it or not. If you're using like Office 365, again, any Apple product, tools like Clio for practice management, you could really go on and on and on. Gmail, which is free email, free to a certain extent, I guess. But these are essentially anything you're using on your computer where you're not creating the system, either that it's housed on or creating the software itself. If it's on the internet. Essentially, you're using the software as a service. So, and those could be, as I mentioned here, white-labeled services. So services that are essentially licensed through somebody else that you're using, and that could refer to products that are complete, or not quite complete that you kind of finish up. But it just really encompasses a lot, and again, I think this goes back to the poll question in terms of where people are storing their client files or information, in terms of what some of that misconception is in terms of where stuff is. But that any of these things, any of these softwares, you're using cloud software, cloud systems. Anything to add?
Yeah, and again, going back just for a second to that house metaphor, this is if you buy the infrastructure versus buying the platform versus buying software as a service. At this point, when you're talking about software as a service, you're buying mostly the finished service. There's very little for you to do except use it.
Use it.
It's like buying the finished house or leasing the finished house. And by the way, it already has furniture in it.
Just bring your toothbrush.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and again, it's if you use QuickBooks Online, I mean, there's so many different aspects to the software as a service that if you're using the internet, more chances are you're using a software as a service platform. So, and then, again, we break into, how, clients are using the cloud just generally.
So let's talk briefly about e-commerce. Anytime that you're online and you're buying anything, that's electronic commerce or e-commerce. That should not be a surprise to most people at this point. Amazon, Google, anything that you're buying, iTunes, you name it, books, movies. There's no end right now. At this point, there is, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but as much as 25% to one-third of all purchases during Christmas are done online these days. There's no reason why those numbers shouldn't be bigger. That's why bricks and mortar retail has had a very hard time in recent years because so many people are buying so much more online, and that's all e-commerce.
So, and again, and that's that's the cloud, right? So
that's the cloud. Also, it should be noted for those dealing with the criminal side, there is criminal e-commerce. It goes by a lot of different names, some of which, not surprisingly or intentionally, mysterious and dark, such as dark web, dark net, and so on. Every so often, and of course, the authorities are looking to shut that down as much as possible. One well-known person, at least who made a fable for himself, was the Dread Pirate Roberts, who was recently apprehended. He was running essentially an online e-commerce service for those who didn't want to be tracked by the authorities. And suffice to say that although the authorities are still coming up to speed on how unauthorized commerce is being done online, whether or not it's legal or illegal, it might be unauthorized or not easily tracked, the authorities have been learning better how to track it.
Yeah, that's an interesting for anyone who hasn't heard of that case. It was the Silk Road was that platform that his alias is the Dread Pirate Roberts, but now it's inmate number or something or other. But so he was just sentenced recently.
Life in prison, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. So he, in terms of basically created a platform, similar to, like a Craigslist or eBay or Amazon, whatever. Basically, a platform to facilitate, illicit commerce and primarily drug sales, but all sorts of other things. So that stuff, is obviously the negative aspects of the cloud. But
yeah, I mean, another aspect of the positive side, we have some references here to business apps and services, the account consumer apps. When building a business online, when building an electronic commerce business online, with all these technologies, all these layers, you can think of them as building blocks. If you want to build a new business online, it's easier than ever because you can build a business online by licensing and using all these other bits and pieces so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you want an e-commerce site that sells hard goods, you want an e-commerce site that downloads music or that downloads documents or downloads something else or provides some other services online, a large chunk of the business you build can be built using pieces that are available to you for a small fee. And you don't have to write that code. You have somebody else who has that code working for themselves to license it to you. It works very well.
There's, in terms of how your clients are using the cloud, storage, I think, is a big aspect of that, not just for clients, but for attorneys as well. How are business and personal documents stored? Is data being backed up? Is there file sharing between businesses, individuals? Whether it's Dropbox, Box, Google Docs, again, OneDrive, Apple Cloud, any of the multitude of backup systems and tools that are used to automatically back up your documents. Those are all things that kind of would fall into that, and there's a huge convenience to using them, and a lot of times cost savings. But there's also considerations that we'll get into in terms of security and issues to keep in mind. But people use those things constantly. Convenience is probably the largest factor. I think cost is a close second. But those things are people use without even realizing that a lot of times that you're using that. In fact, I think I would be hard pressed to say any kind of decent sized firm where at least one person in the firm isn't accessing their or putting files in either emailing to themselves to use later and access later because it's convenient, using their personal Dropbox account. I mean, it happens every day. I just see it constantly. And where we manage a lot of ESI for clients and they transfer files to us, try to recommend using as secure means as possible, using our own file sharing site, which we know and trust. Still there are plenty of times we get Dropbox links from folks' Dropbox accounts. So, that type of thing for sure happens often. So, and then innovation in terms of kind of what Fred was just talking about, the ability to create something, create a business using cloud technology, whether it's e-commerce or otherwise. It just there's a world opened up because that technology is so available and is so accessible.
Yeah, the innovation side especially, we have references here to big data, to marketing and so on. There's no question about it that for businesses in general and advertising in particular, this is a marvelous technology because you get access to much better data, much faster, much more reliable, and the data itself has become a huge business. Advertisers, companies, anybody who is out selling in any quantity, the amount of good data that's available is just extraordinary at a reasonable price. So the data itself is a huge business. Now that gets into some other legal issues, of course, mostly privacy issues, limitations on how that data may be used and when and where it may be stored and how it may be stored, and we'll get a little bit into that as well a little bit later.
And along those lines, you realize that even a company like Google is an information technology company. They're primarily information company. A lot of Google services are free or low cost, but that doesn't mean they're not selling something somewhere to pay for that. So they're using that information. They're using the information you store on there for their business purposes, whether it's for pointing ads your way and selling marketing, or for their other projects that they have going on. But kind of the best way I've heard it explained, and the name escapes me, but basically, if the service is free, then you, the user, are the product. So that's and again, it's people I think don't realize, but that's I think accurate in a lot of the cases. The Googles, Facebooks, and even from the big data standpoint, a lot of municipalities are opening up data sources to hopefully promote economic development, but also the benefit. Philadelphia here has an open data that they've been trying to push out, to open up data sources that they have to be used for innovation. So.
Could all the attendees please type the passcode into the Q&A? Okay, our first question is, with your critique of Dropbox, Box.com, etc., what secure cloud computing do you recommend? I know of other firms that use something similar to myvirtualpc.com.
I don't have any necessarily experience with myvirtualpc.com, but I think with any of them, I think you need to. The issue is, I think you need to do your due diligence in terms of what security they provide and what flexibility they give you for added security measures. So I prefer to not use strict consumer fronting type of ones like a Dropbox. I know Dropbox has and their enterprise version, but part of it just depends, in terms of who needs access, what types of files you're storing. If it's your kids' birthday party pictures or something like that, that may be well and good. But if you're storing privileged and confidential client documents or communications, I probably would say that's not good enough. The standard typically, and we'll get into it when it comes to determining if you've taken appropriate measures, basically comes down to reasonableness. Did you take reasonable steps to just going with whatever is easiest and cheapest? In my non-legal opinion, would be that probably does not constitute taking reasonable steps.
And to flesh that out a little bit more, the time and time again on technology standards, and we'll be talking a little bit about this later on, the bar associations have figured out, and you'll see on the guidance, that they don't necessarily recommend, and we can't recommend any particular service, because any recommendation that might make sense today doesn't necessarily apply tomorrow. There's a bunch of underlying issues there. One, of course, is we have the arms race involving security. What is secure today and what is considered to be sufficient security today is not sufficient security for tomorrow. So as lawyers, we're required to use the appropriate amount of security to keep the kind of data we're storing secure. And that's true whether the data we're storing for our clients is more or less sensitive, more or less interesting to the bad guys who want to steal it. That's always been true. So if we're working on a matter that could lead to, might be a securities matter worth, $1 billion, we're going to use a lot more security than storing files for a small business where nobody's trying to get into that information besides you and the client. So you're trying to tailor the amount of security to the risk that you and your clients are facing. So that's always going to be a due diligence issue that you have on an ongoing basis. Some of the providers of online services, of cloud computing-based services, will be able to explain to you how strong their security is and whether it meets particular standards. The standards themselves, of course, such as they are, there's no single standard that is promulgated by any bar association intentionally because they're just not in that business. Also be aware that some of the standards might be good for one purpose, but for not another purpose. One example, I believe the Federal Trade Commission at one point was looking into a breach of credit card information by a large company, and the large company said, well, we met a standard known as PCI, Payment Card Infrastructure, DSS, Data Security Standards, and the SEC said, well, yes, you met the PCI DSS standard, which is an internal standard that is promulgated by the payment card industry, but the fact that you were hacked, the fact that you had credit card numbers that you gave up, and based on our own review, you knew that even though you met PCI DSS, it was not your own security is not up to date. Therefore, that company was fined by FTC, even though it met a standard. So we can't recommend particular companies. What we do commend is that you look at the security that you need for the matters that you are running for your clients, how sensitive is the data, and ask those questions of your providers.
Yeah, and part of it, just real quick, to finish up on that, the question, I would say put the same thought and effort you would into choosing a cloud provider as you would for your, in terms of the security and everything of your internal infrastructure. So put that same kind of effort and mindfulness, into whatever you use for the cloud, instead of it, unfortunately, I think a lot of people it's an afterthought. In that realm, part of the reason, we're actually in the middle of putting together a managed service file sharing solution for folks where, we manage users, we manage everything, to take some of, to apply that type of mindset to it. Just like you would manage your IT infrastructure, that goes into that. So to take it a step further in terms of managing, not managing the data, but also managing users and the use of the data. So that's something that we're doing for some clients. But, again, I would say whether you use something like that, or decided to on any one of the products, put some thought into it and spend some time, read the terms and conditions, and see what they really do or don't do.
Okay. The next question is, we know that software can be copyrighted. In the past, public data rearranged has not been protected by IP laws. How is this landscape changing?
The landscape's changing a little bit, and it's also a different answer depending upon whether you're in the U.S., the European Union, or elsewhere. Currently in the U.S., we have a relatively small number of cases dealing with data. Mostly those cases involved white page telephone books and yellow page telephone books, one case of which went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. In that case, the U.S. Supreme Court held that a white pages telephone directory was not protected by copyright law because taking what essentially was public data, person's last name, comma, first name, rearranging it, and providing a telephone number was not sufficiently original to be protected by copyright law. Separate from that, there have been some attempts in Congress that have not been passed. At this point, there's no expectation they will be passed, to take compilations of data and give them copyright protection or other protection. There's also an international treaty that protects compilations of data that U.S. has not joined. So that particular treaty is not enforceable in the U.S. In other countries, especially the European Union, they have a data directive, not a privacy directive, but a separate data directive, where if somebody has built an original database and then somebody else without protection takes a chunk of that data without permission, that's a violation of that particular law. That is not the law in the U.S., though. So be aware that what is may be true and may be allowed in the U.S. is not allowed and is a violation of law in other jurisdictions. So currently, if you have public data, especially, you might be able to create something that's protected by copyright if you arrange that data in a new and non-trivial manner. But and there have been some cases on that, but not as many cases to provide clear guidance. Outside the U.S., there is better protection of databases, but the standards are a little bit different.
Okay, we're going to continue with the presentation, but there will be another Q&A at the end.
So let's talk a little bit about jurisdiction. So the last question actually gets us a little bit into that. Not surprisingly, one of the problems that we've always been running into with the cloud in general telecommunications for many years is whose law controls. In the very early days, you had some people in the industry who were hoping that that human law would not apply, that somehow cyberspace and the online networks were free of law. And of course, it's usually the opposite. Anytime that a jurisdiction, a country or other jurisdiction tries to assert control, you end up often with multiple countries asserting control over the same circumstances of the same issues. We have to ask a bunch of questions. One of the first questions we ask is, since a lot of the technology, talking about computers, where is the computer based? Where is the server based? In the law, under many laws in many countries, where that server is based will be sufficient for the laws of that country or that jurisdiction to be asserted. That's especially true in things such as privacy law, contract law, intellectual property, and we'll be getting into this a little bit more, especially with privacy law, which prohibits transferring data out of the EU to countries that have lesser protection. So even though in the cloud you may be an individual based in the U.S., you store your data on some service. That could be Amazon, it could be Google, it could be thousands of other services. You may not know where that server is based. You may not know that by saving your client's data to that server, that service, that suddenly your client's data is being stored in Ireland, or it's being stored in the Philippines, or it's being stored almost any place else on this planet. And the laws of that jurisdiction will apply to that data now that it's on that server.
So an example of that, there's a Microsoft issue with Microsoft that's currently ongoing and still on appeal in the Second Circuit. And the gist of it is that Microsoft was served a warrant for email that was held by a user. Just so happens that the data was stored in a data center in Ireland. So although the user was U.S.-based, the data was in Ireland, unbeknownst to the user. And essentially, Microsoft is challenging the fact that a U.S.-based search warrant gives access to that data. Instead, that international treaties would be would rule what happens with that data. So far, the decisions haven't worked out in Microsoft's favor. But again, it's still on that as of the time this was written. That was still on appeal. I guess you ask, okay, well, the question comes, well, why would the data center be in Ireland anyways? Part of the reason is cost. Certain areas there's going to be lesser costs. With companies having moving headquarters internationally or having locations internationally, they may want that those data centers local. But also, you'll find a lot of folks outside the U.S., especially Europe, Canada, they do not want their data stored in U.S. data centers. And part of that, or a big part of that, comes back to things like the Patriot Act, which essentially gives the U.S. government free rein to access a lot of that data and creates significant privacy issues that don't mesh with European law. So there's a huge issue with that. We see it in hosting e-discovery data for international clients. Typically they want a data center either located in Europe or in Canada, as opposed to being in the U.S. So, and that's something that where the opposite is fine. Generally speaking, it's not as big of an issue because our rules here in the U.S. are much more lax when it comes to privacy than they are overseas. Anything else? Yeah.
So the other thing I already mentioned, you look at the server as well. How else do you confer jurisdiction? Where's the user? If the person using the data is in a particular location, even if the data is on a different continent, the location of the user can confer jurisdiction on that particular location. So local law, consumer protection law, which changes very much. Even in the U.S., consumer protection law changes dramatically from state to state. Outside the U.S., of course, it also changes quite a bit. Contract law can be different. Whether or not there's privacy policy, a lot of privacy law, again, we use that as a good example because privacy law is a lot more developed in this particular context. But again, it's another example where the same data, different people, same person, different laws apply simultaneously.
And here the reference is just the California reference to the California privacy policy in their state. So, and basically it goes into if even if you have an internet business in New York, but you have California users, you may be subject there. That business may be subject to the privacy rules in California if those users are based in California. So, those are just some things to consider since the internet is everywhere. And that kind of breaks into the cloud service agreements and issues related to that. In terms of who's responsible for the software used in the cloud. Who's the one who uploads, stores, and processes the data. So who is the one who's responsible for all that?
And we have the contractual provisions and mostly click-wrap agreements, but it doesn't matter whether it's a click-wrap agreement or that you sign online or whether it's a hard copy agreement. Essentially, that's irrelevant in 99% of the cases. The question is, what does the contract say? Is the contract enforceable? A lot of shifting of the fees, a lot of shifting of liability, a lot of shifting of risk. And that's probably the best way to look at it. Given the amount of money you're paying, how much risk are you taking on, how much risk is the other party taking on. That's true whether you're the business providing that service or whether you're the person who's using that service. Who's responsible if laws are violated? The service provider, if you're the service provider, you obviously don't want to be responsible for that. Sometimes you can control that, sometimes you can't. So why should you be responsible? If you're the user, then you should be aware of that.
I think most of the time you'd find the YouTubes and all those of the world, Twitters. You'd find if you looked at the the service agreements or the terms and conditions that they're putting it off on the user, and they will fight hard to make sure that they don't own that liability. So, and I think, and I don't have the examples on hand, but I'm sure that I know for a fact there's examples out there where they basically say it's not me. So
yeah, on top of that you have, and this gets into our next slide, who's responsible in case of a breach or intellectual property infringement. In many cases where there's liability for actions taken online, especially in privacy law, but also in intellectual property and some other cases, the answer might be all of the above. In privacy law, when you have a case where some personal information is being captured, stored, used, or forwarded in a way that violates applicable law, the authority, whether it's a U.S. entity, EU entity, Canadian, whatever country they're in, might go after both the user, the person who entered that data into the database, as well as the company who runs the service, who might be referred to as data controller or processor. In each case, the laws say, well, we don't care who's supposed to be responsible. We will hold everybody liable, and you can sort it out amongst yourselves. In other cases, such as intellectual property infringement, there will be, or there may be, depending upon what law we're talking about and what issue, specific type of infringement we're talking about, there may be an inquiry to who's responsible and who did what. But as part of that process, they can sue everybody, see who's responsible, and by the time that one entity gets out because they're not responsible, they find that they're $10,000, $20,000, $40,000 into the litigation. There's also in the U.S. a safe harbor approach for service providers that get them out of intellectual property infringement if a user infringes somebody's copyright but the service provider was on part of that process. There are specific laws in the U.S. and outside the U.S. you should be aware of, and that some of that is liability shifting.
I would talk briefly about cloud services that lawyers, attorneys use that are available. I won't get too deep into some of these. I mean, a lot of them people know. In terms of storage of documents, again, things like Box, Dropbox, people use constantly. OneHub is another. Ignite's another. The list goes on. Google Docs is another tool that folks use in terms of document writing, editing, and doing using those types of things. And like I said, OneDrive from Microsoft should be in that top list since it's kind of default for anyone with a Windows system, it seems like these days. And it's something that I've seen multiple issues pop up in recent forensic investigation matters when it comes to OneDrive, since it just is there and Microsoft wants to default to it. And then, you have everything, these other software as a service types of tools. So Salesforce, Insightly, Zoho for CRM. There's probably 24 more that you would find real quick in a Google search. Accounting, billing software, so tools like Clio, Rocket Matter, Time Matters, QuickBooks. There's a bunch of those, more and more coming out. It seems like every day, and then kind of where the bulk of the realm in terms of document review that I get into, so Viewpoint, Relativity, Disco, EDT. I mean, there's a lot of tools there, and those tools you can either buy, essentially as software itself and install locally. You can buy, as a platform, as a service in some ways these days now, or straight as a software as a service. So there's a lot more, where, in the old days it used to be concordance and summation, and those were your two choices, and it would be installed on your local desktop. And now even concordance and summation, I'm not even sure if summation sells their desktop version anymore. I think they've primarily moved to the cloud, if not completely. And concordance, I know you still can, but again, it's available as a cloud service as well. So I mean, there's so many tools out there, and the speed of these tools for collecting and managing and reviewing ESI for discovery. I mean, there's so many tools out there now, and the benefit to what they can do is significant. And then you have online virtual data rooms, online war rooms, like SecureDoc, Citrix, Smart Room, again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many names, and again, with the broad kind of internet connectivity, more and more of these apps, even like a QuickBooks, concordance type of thing, are driving to be cloud hosted as opposed to installed locally, and that for sure is a trend. In Office 365, you don't even need Microsoft Office locally anymore. And then and one thing to note, web-based email is considered in some jurisdictions considered cloud computing, and so that's one thing to keep in mind there. And to kind of further go into some of the discovery documents, so, again, these are your clients' documents that you're managing and storing for their litigation. And it's something to consider making sure you have the appropriate safeguards and thought in place in terms of how specifically you're going to manage them, who you're going to manage them with, if not internally. Those are all important things to consider. It's not unheard of for us to go through a lengthy security process for clients who want to make sure our data center is up to par, and that we have and there aren't holes in our systems. And we've done that for some large multinational corporations. So because you have to put that type of thing in. And in fact, I would say that we have to make sure that our security is better than our clients at the firms for them to feel to kind of get the warm and fuzzies about security. So that's something to think about. So part of the reason is because when you think about e-discovery, typically it's going to be the most sensitive documents that your client has. So you need to essentially, because we're gathering and collecting the important stuff. So the important documents, the most potentially most embarrassing, the most sensitive documents, and you have to put the appropriate level of security and attention to that. So and that goes into how do you decide between local storage versus cloud, whether it's in your firm or your vendor, and that it depends on your specific need. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Although different people selling different solutions will try and convince you of that. It's not necessarily the case. Obviously, security should be first and foremost. But also in terms of what you need to do, you have to factor some of those things in terms of how you need to access it and use it as well. With anything, beware of the free label. Those, while all that's well and good, and we don't want to spend money, and typically our clients don't want to spend money. Usually, there's negatives to those types of things, and then whether you use a public or private cloud is something to consider, and that basically means public cloud is something that all users have access to, not necessarily your data, but they have their own accounts in that same cloud environment. Private cloud meaning it's more confined. And then evidence in terms of evidence in the cloud, preserving and collecting your clients' ESI. Keep in mind that the more your clients use proprietary systems or have cloud data, it can actually increase the cost of collecting and preserving ESI as opposed to decreasing it. And that's because it's not made to be accessible to third parties necessarily. And for those purposes. So that's a whole different thing. And we're getting down on time. So if anyone has questions on that, I'd be happy to answer them at a later time. And then general guidance in terms of where to look. If you want to touch on that for 60 seconds, and then we can go to questions.
Sure. And we mentioned this briefly before, but so for American Bar Association and the state bar associations have not endorsed particular products, and that's probably a good thing. What they do, as some of them do, especially American Bar Association's Law Technology section, does is they'll do reviews and then they'll update those reviews, which gives you a good idea as to what might be good technology for your use. But you still have to, each lawyer has to do his or her own due diligence to make sure that they have the right product for the right tool for the right purpose, and that it's sufficiently secure as near as you can tell. But that's there are no specific statements that you must use this or you must do that or that must have a specific level of security. Some of that might change in the future. On the law practice side, I don't expect that in the short term. Very good questions.
And then for here, I would say from a technology perspective, kind of the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That type of thing, and with the other questions about using things like Dropbox and things like that, you may find that whatever that tool is right for you, but the key is putting the effort into finding out if that's the case as opposed to making assumptions about it. And even just general, whatever it is you're doing, putting the time and effort in upfront to make sure that there's some checks and balances there can be a huge, huge difference maker, and I think can potentially benefit what Fred was just talking about in terms of making sure that you meet whatever that hurdle is that's been set forth. And even the basics, we find can limit a lot of concerns. I've done a lot of talks recently on data security. And part of it, I think part of the key is, while it's extremely difficult, almost impossible to be 100% secure, you can make it so you're not the low-hanging fruit and let somebody else be the low-hanging fruit that is easy for someone to breach or to hack. And I think those things can be basic things. It doesn't have to be, hundreds of thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars to do those things. A lot of that is human-based things that you can do. And then, again, technology is only as good as those using it. So, a lot of times a breach or a hack starts with somebody who gets phished. So, and phishing is essentially, emails and things get sent out hoping someone's going to click to open that window into your network for the hacker. The idea, like the Target breach, where the Target stores were breached with all that credit card information. The idea that's out there is that was started with a phishing attack email on one of their vendors, which opened a backdoor to that vendor, who had a backdoor to Target systems, and they worked their way to the credit card terminals to input their information there. So that's something to consider. Is that the human factor can outdo any technology you put into place. And so we have a final poll question. Whether based on our talk now that over the last hour, or just generally, if you see yourself storing client files in the cloud in the future. If you could answer the question, and we'll check the results.
You see the change from the earlier review, earlier discussion. There's no question about it, especially for the more mature services out there, the ones that understand privacy, security concerns, that the more mature service providers will provide sufficient security for clients' files. Whether or not that still meets the expectations of you or of your clients, you may want to have that conversation.
And could all the attendees please type the passcode once again into the Q&A? We are running short on time, so we won't be able to answer a ton of questions, but we will have the presenters follow up with you if there are additional questions. So our first question is your primary criticism with a service like Box a security issue, or do you have additional concerns?
For me, it's primarily security, and just to use a technical term, the willy-nilly nature of people who use it. But it also goes into, and I think there was another question, but it also goes into the commingling of business and personal files because people use it as one and the same. They provide access to family members, again for the party inviter, and it's more. I would say it's more human actual security issues, in my opinion, than necessarily data. There's like security protocols and breaching, their data center. Although I believe there was an issue, there was a case where email addresses and things like that were stolen from Dropbox. I don't remember the specifics, but I would say, again, I think more security is going to be better than less, and there's enough convenience benefit from enterprise-level systems, without huge costs, and maybe incrementally more costs, but without a significant cost difference in using business geared tools as opposed to using consumer geared tools.
Yeah, and on the legal side, again, we don't have specific guidance as to whether a particular service is or is not sufficient. So some of that, again, you're looking at whatever evidence you do have. You have some reviews with the legal press, some reviews from the non-legal press. You're looking to see whether or not there have been breaches. And yes, you have to tailor it so that you know that if client files you're trying to store there are not the most sensitive thing in the world, that may be sufficient security. But if you have a highly sensitive set of materials that are client materials, those you may not want to put into a system that you're not sure has high level of security. Some of the online systems will claim higher levels of security. You have to do your due diligence, not just accept those claims.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, those are all the questions that we have time for right now, but like I said, we will be emailing you the answers if you did ask a question and we didn't get to it. In addition to being your best source for testifying and consulting experts, TASA also offers e-discovery and document management solutions, free interactive webinars, and research reports on expert witnesses. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and especially Fred Wilf and Shawn Huston for their time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with either of the presenters, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case that you are working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. Thank you all again for attending, and have a great day, everyone.